So, on behalf of the Equality Party, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event, an hour of ideas and reflection, and I hope some productive discomfort as we explore the forces that shape the rise and fall of civilizations. It's not often we get the chance to hear from someone who studies the big picture, not just the latest headline or policy debate, but the long history of humanity itself. And our speaker tonight, Dr. Luke Kemp, does exactly that. Luke is a researcher at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and his work explores the patterns behind societal collapse from ancient civilizations like the Roman Empire and the Maya to the challenges facing our own world today. And his central question is simple and profound: why do societies fall, and what can we learn before it's too late? So his new book, Goliath's Curse, The Past and Future of Societal Collapse, I have my copy here, takes us on a journey through time, looking at how power, inequality, and ecological strain have repeatedly brought mighty empires to their knees. But it's not just a story of doom. I've not got to the end yet, so I don't know what the end is. It's a story of insight and agency. Luke challenges us to recognise the warning signs of collapse, but also to see the possibilities for renewal and cooperation and resilience. And that's what makes tonight's discussion especially relevant to us at the Equality Party. Our movement is built on the belief that a fairer, more balanced society isn't just a moral ideal, it's the foundation of long-term stability. So when inequality grows unchecked, we see that communities feel voiceless and the powerful become detached from the common good. And history tells us that the cracks begin to form, and we see plenty of evidence of this around us in the world right now, too. So Dr. Kemp's research puts those truths into a global and historical context, showing how they've played out across the centuries and what they mean for us today. I'm sure many of you, like me, are really eager to hear how these lessons from past collapses can inform a more equal, sustainable, and humane future. Luke's been described as as a historian of the future and a realist with a hopeful heart, someone who sees clearly the risks we face, but also believes we have the tools to change course. So I'm going to ask Luke to speak to us for 30 to 40 minutes and follow up with questions and discussion for us all. If you do have a burning question in the middle, I'm sure Luke won't mind a little interruption, but let's assume that that's the format we're going to stick to. And without further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Luke Kemp. Thank you, Luke. Over to you.
Okay, many thanks for the introduction. As mentioned, I'll try to speak for 30 to 40 minutes and keep this relatively brief. And today I want to talk to you about one of the key themes of the book, which is the role of wealth inequality in both the rise and also fall of societies throughout history. So let's start with the rise. When I first started this book, I wanted to focus purely upon collapse, but it became very apparent very quickly that in order to understand what's collapsing and why, you have to think about why it began. That is, why did civilizations and states first form, and what do they mean for the people living through them? As Aristotle once said, if you were to understand anything, observe its beginnings and its development. So much of the book becomes about formation, not just collapse. And when we talk about formation, we have to take a very big picture look. Humans evolved into Homo sapiens sapiens roughly 300,000 years ago. So we've been anatomically modern for roughly 300,000 years during what's called the Middle Paleolithic. This was a time of recurrent ice ages. The world was roughly 5 degrees cooler, and almost a third of the world was covered in ice sheets. We evolved in numerous parts of Africa, and Africa at the time had 86 active volcanoes. So this was not a particularly easy time to live. And then, of course, things changed dramatically during the Holocene roughly 12,000 years ago when the Earth entered a warm and unnaturally stable climatic period. But most of the time, we evolved in the Middle Paleolithic, this time of recurrent ice ages. And when we think of collapse, we do have an image of how people tend to act in what's often referred to as a state of nature, a period when there's no overarching authority structures like a king. This is primarily shaped by the 16th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And his key idea was that when humans are not overseen by an arbiter, such as a king or military, we tend to engage in a selfish scramble for resources. meaning life for most of us is, in his words, nasty, brutish, and short. And this is an image which colors all our depictions of collapse, whether it's Mad Max or The Road. And yet, when you look at the Paleolithic, when you look at the archaeological record, things look very different. For the first 300,000 years, we lived in relative equality. We were nomadic, egalitarian hunter-gatherers, essentially getting what we need from the environment for subsistence to live, and then moving on. This is not just small ragtag groups of families, but rather less than 10% of any individual band was made up of closely related individuals. And people throughout their lifetimes often would have known thousands of others because they're constantly cycling and moving across different groups. And that constant mobility, that cycling across groups, meant that in many ways we actually had these vast societies of a shared culture, lithics, so stone tools, musical instruments, technology, and of course, genes. So if we look at the Aurignacian culture, which is basically stretching all the way from Siberia to modern-day Spain, approximately 40,000 years ago, you see similar figurines, similar arrowheads, etc. being used. The same is true of Africa, roughly 120,000 years ago, where all the way from the east coast to the west coast, people were trading. And we have the Clovis culture of North America, which basically stretches all the way from the north actually through to the south, of shared lithic tools, arrowheads. They're all using very similar designs for their arrowheads and blades. And it's this sharing, particularly of genes, that allows us to survive. While people often speculated that Neanderthals, which one is depicted here, were very different to us, much stupider, etc., that doesn't seem to be true. Neanderthals and many other hominids were very similar to us, even in their intellectual and cognitive capacities. And the reason they die out, it doesn't appear it's because we killed them. There's only two skeletons of Neanderthals with projectile wounds. Instead, the leading theory across paleoanthropologists is that it died out because of demographics. In short, because we were equal and constantly moving across different bands, it meant that we had a lot of genetic diversity. In contrast, Neanderthals had very fragmented, isolated communities, which meant they had a lack of genetic diversity. Indeed, some burials found that the different Neanderthal remains had roughly the same genetic diversity as endangered mountain gorillas. This made them very vulnerable. It would be difficult for us to essentially have these great fluid civilizations, as I call them, unless we had low violence. And often you'll hear that we had really high rates of violence, that roughly a quarter of people were dying at the hands of another human being. Steven Pinker famously made this argument, but the problem is that his list has three duplicates. Three only have one body, and there's only actually one site from prehistory, from the Ice Age. In comparison, the much more systematic studies across 3,000 skeletons and 400 sites have found that there's actually very low rates of violence, essentially only roughly 1 to 2%. This is also true of genetic studies of lethal violence. And this shows through in the way we behave during disasters, including during collapses. People tend to be very altruistic, pro-social, and good at self-organizing. Some of you may have heard of boat lift. So, in the wake of 9/11, after the terrorist attacks, the Coast Guard sent out a call for people to be evacuated from Manhattan across the Hudson River. What ensued was the largest maritime evacuation, done almost entirely bottom up by individuals commanding their own boats and lifting people from New York across the Hudson Bay. 500,000 people moved in one day. So we're quite good at responding to disasters, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We wouldn't have survived the Ice Age if we weren't. And this really challenges our typical ideas of collapse, that collapse is a kind of reversion to our baser instincts. Instead, collapse often shows the best of us. And you can see this in the benefits of collapse. For instance, after the fall of the 1991 Barre regime in Somalia, people seem to be better off. Maternal mortality drops by 30%, infant mortality by 24%, and extreme poverty by 20%. In short, you're better off living underneath local governments and in a more stateless society than under the predatory Barre regime. What happens? Why is it that we end up in much more unequal societies in which often a king or a small group of elites are monopolizing much of the wealth? When you look across the world, there's a similar story in almost every cradle of civilization, as we often call it. Essentially, over thousands of years after the Holocene, people start settling down, they start to grow more and more agriculture. Eventually, there is warfare, usually accompanying agriculture, and then eventually the formation of states and empires. And this happens in every single world region, barring a few such as Australia. Yeah, this is no simple story of agriculture causing inequality and causing the development of elite cultures. When you look across the world, there's 10 different areas that develop agricultural food production independently. Yet only four of these, the Near East, China, Mesoamerica, and the South Andes, develop states. They develop the very first large-scale empires, for instance. The key difference here is it's not necessarily about having agriculture or a surplus. Instead, it's about a certain type of resource. If we compare Papua New Guinea to China, sorry, Papua New Guinea to Egypt, I should say, both had agriculture roughly 7,000 years ago. The difference is that in Egypt, they were growing wheat. In Papua New Guinea, they were growing taro and bananas. And of course, Papua New Guinea never developed pharaohs or pyramids. The key thing here is that taro, sweet potato, and bananas both can be not stored for a long period of time. They can usually be stored for roughly 1 to 6 months. And importantly, they're fairly invisible. You can leave them underground for a long period of time, even after their harvest. By contrast, rice, corn, and wheat, the things we typically associate with civilization, are things, resources that can be stored for a long period of time. They can be easily spotted and can be easily taken as well. So they're all what I call lootable resources. They're easily seen, stolen, and stored. And combined with a few other factors, which I won't go too far into, this meant that eventually you had the rise of wealth inequality. Once you get agricultural intensification, once you get lootable resources, you start to get bigger differences in wealth. And those differences in wealth tend to also mean bigger differences in power. It's pretty rare that an elite doesn't eventually try to become a king, and very rare that a king doesn't try to make themselves into a religious figure or the commander of the military. In many ways, this is a form of evolutionary backsliding. We start to look less like typical humans and more like the hierarchies of chimpanzees and the harems of gorillas, with one key difference. Wealth inequality and differences of power, in our case, can be passed across generations. Even today, every billionaire under the age of 30 has inherited their wealth. That's something we don't see in chimps or gorillas. And all this is not just built upon little resources, but also warfare. In every single case, before you have the rise of one of these early civilizations, you see the emergence of large-scale warfare. Why is it that we go from being relatively equal, relatively altruistic groups to being ones which a few dominate the rest? What I put forward is that while we're all pretty decent at heart, there is variation across individuals, and most importantly, we all have a desire for status. Status competition is one of the drivers of history. Status, the desire to be admired, loved, and respected by others, gives us a reproductive advantage. People who have status tend to have more children. Those children are more likely to live to adulthood. But throughout most of history, status was controlled. Those who try to dominate a group in nomadic egalitarian groups tend to be countered through different strategies, ranging from ridicule, ostracism, being kicked out of a group, through to in-group executions. Eventually, that changes, and you start to get the emergence of pharaohs, kings, elites. And while it often looks like they're doing it for the money, they're doing it for the resources and goods, at heart is still always a desire for status. Here's a very telling quote from a billionaire. Well, it's actually a millionaire, but kind of a modern billionaire in many ways, for the 1920s, a man by the name of Harold Huntington, who said that for practical purposes, someone who has $200,000 a year is just as well off as I am. Money's just a way of keeping score. Keeping score, of course, in a game of status. Most people do want status, but only very few are willing to take it through force, intimidation, and bullying. And generally speaking, those who desire status and do it through domination are higher in the dark triad, which is a set of three antisocial personality characteristics, including psychopathy, a lack of empathy and callousness, narcissism, an overflated sense of ego, and Machiavellianism, a willingness to manipulate others for personal gain. And it's pretty easy to see how these are, of course, represented or overrepresented in our modern world leaders. And status competition also helps to explain the early indicators of inequality we see. When you look in the archaeological record for inequality, we tend to look for certain things like human sacrifice, grave goods, so decorations and weapons that have been transported often from thousands of kilometers away, monuments, usually for an individual or small group, such as the case of palaces and temples and pyramids. And of course, unequal housing, mansions and palaces relative to others. And the key thing here is that status competition has a certain way of manifesting itself. It does so through excessive wasteful use of energy. In all these cases, while they may provide some co-benefits, the monuments and, of course, decorations given to those who are buried are usually there as a way of signaling status, but they don't really help the group very much. This is a very big change from hunter-gatherers who tend to be very frugal with their energy for obvious reasons, and they practice what many anthropologists call a principle of least effort. They tend to try to minimize energy expenditure and maximize leisure as a general rule of thumb. And what this meant is roughly 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, once you see the emergence of these early civilizations and states, you see a contraction in the Y chromosome, in male diversity, basically, which means that a small group of men were starting to monopolize reproduction. Just think of the harems of, say, for instance, imperial courts in China and elsewhere. And the very earliest states were all pretty explicitly built on violence. There's the Palette of Namur from the world's very first ruler, Namur, and the first dynasty of Egypt. And here is the world's very first emperor, Sargon, both of which displaying them smashing the heads of their rivals. And when you look at the great record across the Near East of skeletal remains of violence, it's pretty clear that the the Mesolithic and Copper Age, when you had the creation of the first states, experienced great violence, as did the collapse. So the key thing here is that collapse and state formation are kind of the same. It's about small groups, usually of armed young men, seeking status and to create new power structures through the use of violence. In the book, I try to move away from the term civilization, even though I've been using it thus far, for a good reason that civilization has always been really hard to define. While we often talk about the collapse of civilizations, most people don't have a good definition of what civilization is. Instead, they tend to fall upon things like a checklist of factors like long distance trade, which all hunter-gatherers have mentioned, as mentioned, had, or for instance, writing, which big empires like the Incan Empire, which stretched all the way from Argentina to Chile, did not have. And civilization has always been a term of propaganda. It comes from the Latin root civilitas, which has connotations of being politically wise, virtuous, good conduct, moderation, restraint. And yet, as shown, it's warfare that actually precedes all of these earlier states. And what they really were was not a change towards civilization or civilized conduct. They usually meant the rise of inequality, patriarchy, slavery, and mass human sacrifice. But the key thing here is that it was emergence of dominance hierarchies, systems of status in which a small group are ranked above others permanently, and that's passed down across generations. And this isn't just about having a government, it's not just simply about the Roman Empire, for instance. Rome was also upheld by other distinctions of status and domination, such as master and slave, men, women, rich and poor. And it's the collection of those dominance hierarchies that make what I call a Goliath. And the reason we don't tend to think of civilizations as Goliath, and the reason why we tend to have a pretty optimistic view of the beginning of states, is because of what I call the 1% view of history. Essentially, that when we look to the past, particularly when we look at collapse, we tend to be looking at it through the eyes of elites, through the eyes of kings. Namely, because most archaeological artifacts tend to be things that are owned by elites, such as, of course, large-scale monuments, big houses, palaces, etc. But also, worthwhile bearing in mind, writing tend to be done by a very small number of people employed by the rich and by kings. And when you look at the literature written about collapse, it tends to be just as worried about the reversal of inequality as it is about any kind of bad aspects of collapse. This is a bit of prose from the Admonitions Vipua, which was written after the first intermediate period, after the first collapse in pharaonic power of Egypt. The corn of Egypt is common property. Indeed, the poor man has attained to the state of the nine gods. He who could not make a sarcophagus for himself is now the possessor of a tomb. Behold, noble ladies are now on rafts, and are in the labor establishment, while he who could not sleep even on walls is now the possessor of a bed. Servants spoke freely, the nobles lamented, and the poor rejoiced. Essentially, the admonitions of Vipua spend more time lamenting the reversal of power and wealth than they do talking about starvation, warfare, the things we usually associate with collapse. Because in many ways, collapse was exactly that. It was a reversion of the social order and often a reversion of social inequality. So let's have a quicker, deeper look at collapse. First of all, what is collapse? It's not an ancient apocalypse, as shown. Instead, it's a process in which power structures, whether that be the state, the economy, or even those who control information, such as administrations, bureaucracies, and churches, where there's different structures of power begin to fragment and contract in an enduring and rapid fashion. Collapse is a process with winners and losers, costs and benefits. When we talk about collapse, we're talking about risk, and it's worthwhile bearing in mind that risk is not that simple. It requires four different factors: a hazard, such as, say, for instance, tsunami; a vulnerability, the fact that you can be hit by the hazard, such as having inadequate infrastructure against a tsunami; exposure, lying in the wake of a tsunami; and how you respond can either aggravate or alleviate the risk of collapse. Most of most books on collapse have been preoccupied by thinking about the hazards, in particular climate change, disease, and invaders. And this is pretty obvious in many ways because when we look at collapse, it often is highly correlated with things like warfare, but also in particular climate change. Here I have a layout of some of the earliest states and empires from the early Bronze Age. And as you can see, many of them start falling apart during what's called the 4.2 Ka mega drought, essentially a very large-scale drought that occurred roughly 4,200 years ago. We see a very similar thing with the late Bronze Age collapse, where a very large set of interconnected empires and states fell apart during a mega drought that hit the area of the Mediterranean and Levant roughly 3,000 years ago. And this shows a overview of some of the destroyed sites across the late Bronze Age. Yet, climate isn't a full explanation for what happens here. As mentioned, it's pretty rare this is just simply everyone starving and then turning to warfare. It's not a complete apocalypse. It's often a reversion of the social order. But importantly, there's many areas that don't experience a drought, but do collapse, and others that do experience drought and don't collapse. We see this in the case of the Maya, and we also see it in the case of the late Bronze Age. So in the late Bronze Age, there was a group called the Mycenaean in Greece, essentially original group of warlords who ruled over Lower Greece. One of their key palaces in Pylos essentially experienced wetter conditions prior to the collapse. In other words, it wasn't a drought, and yet it collapses, and afterwards there is a drought. And you see this over and over again across different cases. And importantly, areas that were actually very equal, that didn't have these very top-down, elite-heavy structures, interestingly, in Greece, they didn't collapse. So in Corinthia, Achaea, and the Iberian Gulf, we have numerous communities and societies that were quite equal, and none of them collapsed during the late Bronze Age collapse. And we see a similar thing when we look to the US. The very first farmers in the US and the US Southwest and New Mexico, they experience different termination periods or crisis periods in 700, 890, 1145, and 1285 CE. In each case, there often is drought, but in some cases there's not. And importantly, in every case, there's growing inequality and growing concentrations of power beforehand. And this is the key thing to remember. This isn't just about hazards, it's about vulnerability. And one of the biggest vulnerabilities appears to be growing wealth inequality. And wealth inequality does tend to grow. One review of 28 states across the pre-modern world found that they were on average 77% towards the maximum level of theoretical inequality. That essentially means a situation in which one individual takes all the surplus, leaving everyone else with just enough to survive and reproduce. Most of the world was three-quarters of the way towards that level. And when you look at some of the very first states, cities, and farming communities across the world, it's pretty clear. They often get built up and even create things like monuments, infrastructure, etc., before you get inequality and elites. And it's after you get the intensification of inequality that often things start to fall apart, which makes a lot of sense, particularly in these early communities. People were moving from a state of equality into one of inequality and hierarchy, which must have been quite a traumatic and difficult experience for many. And this just quickly shows how over time, wealth inequality tends to increase until you have what my colleague at Stanford, Walter Schardell, calls a great leveler, an act of usually great violence that redistributes power. This usually takes four forms: a pandemic, a mass bloody revolution, mass mobilization warfare, like in the case of the world wars, or a state collapse. State collapse tends to level wealth inequalities and reset the playing field. In the book, I put forward a model as to how wealth inequality tends to lead to collapse. Importantly, wealth inequality rarely just stays in the realm of wealth. It tends to become inequalities of power in general. As we see today, the rich are usually not that fond of just keeping their money in their bank accounts or in their treasure chests. They want to use it to gain other forms of power. Kings tend to also want riches to eventually become either recognized as a god or head of church. And likewise, the rich tend to eventually want to take a throne or to have their own militaries and armies. We see that today, of course, with billionaires tampering over US democracy, and we see it in the past. Essentially, everyone who ruled over Rome was from the elite class. They were rich. And I won't go too much into this diagram here, but just to quickly outline the different ways in which inequality seems to make societies more vulnerable and fragile. First of all, we know that inequality tends to be innately corrosive to societies. It leads to greater polarization, a lack of trust in institutions, even higher levels of both socio-political violence and environmental degradation. This has been thoroughly documented in a huge number of studies, which are many of which are pretty well documented in the books The Spirit Level and The Inner Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Importantly, as you start to get more inequality, you start to get a growing elite class. In short, society becomes top heavy. You get more and more elites who have a wealth pump and essentially move money, resources, and energy from the lower classes up to the top. This results in an overproduction of elites, leading to elite competition and an immiseration of everyday people. The cost of living crises we experience today do have many historical precedents. This is pretty well documented in a book called End Times by Peter Turchin, as well as numerous pieces of work by his colleague Dan Hoyer. In short, you have that combination of lots of elites battling for power, battling for status, many, many people who are increasingly poor, and that makes society into a bit of a powder keg. It's a good recipe for having coups, civil wars, and warlords. And importantly, as you have more and more elites wanting to take energy from the environment and from the people, it tends to drive certain behaviors, particularly from empires. In general, more elites will usually mean a greater hunger for more resources abroad. In other words, for more conquest. This is a quick quote from the historian Livy documenting what he saw as the expansion of Rome. There is one nation that at its own cost, for its own exertions, at its own risk, has gone to war on behalf of the liberty of others. It renders this service not to those across its frontiers or to the peoples of neighboring states, or to those who dwell on the same mainland, but it crosses the seas in order that nowhere in the wide world may injustice and tyranny exist, but that right and equity and law may be everywhere supreme. Now, if I hadn't have told you that was from Livy, you probably would have guessed that was potentially from the US. Empires have always tended to see themselves as being fairly virtuous and well-meaning in their conquests, but ultimately the conquests are usually there to get more resources. But as you conquer further afield, you tend to get less and less resources and have to spend more and more on your military, which drains the state of its coffers. Not only do you tend to turn to conquest, but elites will also turn to increasing amounts of extraction from the environment. We see the same thing in Rome. Essentially, most of their silver mines were being depleted due to over-extraction of silver. And that meant that over time, they had to have coins of less and less silver. They were debasing their currency, which meant they couldn't pay their military appropriately. But in short, inequality has all these knock-on effects, which tends to make societies more vulnerable, but it also has a big one, which tends to make societies less capable of responding to oncoming disasters and crises. In short, oligarchy. As society becomes more top-heavy and the rich increasingly capture the state, it becomes more difficult to take measures that would address oncoming crises. Rome could not reform its military and it could not reduce its bureaucracy, in large part because elites didn't want it to. Just as similarly today, we have a lot of trouble addressing climate change, not because people in general don't want to act on climate change, but because the wealthiest, particularly those in the fossil fuel industry, ensure that any policy efforts are obstructed. So, in short, there's a whole bunch of knock-on effects from inequality, which tend to make societies more vulnerable until they're hit by some kind of big hazard, such as a shift in the climate, invaders, or disease. But the key thing is, as we showed earlier here, and I have numerous other graphs like this in the book, wealth inequality tends to precede collapse, and there's a very good reason for that. Yet, going to the future, I think wealth inequality has a slightly different way of manifesting itself. I'm less worried about diminishing returns on extraction, on wealth inequality creating greater concentrations of power and making more fragile states and more fragile societies. That could happen. I think we see it happening in the US today, and it could even result in something like an autocracy or civil war. But what I'm more worried about is how systems of inequality and extraction underpin the biggest threats we face today, what we often call existential threats. Things like climate change, nuclear weapons, killer robots, general and planetary degradation, and many others. Currently, roughly 70% of the world's cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Much of this cobalt supply is mined by children, roughly 40,000 of them, and usually by people who are paid $3 to $4 a day to work in some of the world's worst conditions. That cobalt goes into, of course, microchips that are used in lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, basically drones that can select their own targets and kill them without human approval. The cobalt also ends up in large language models. If you're worried about AI as an existential threat in the future, or of course, even just something which is going to cause automation and social disruption, then ultimately cobalt is part of the problem. Cheap cobalt inequality fuels a whole bunch of different threats. The same is true of cheap uranium. Not too far from where cobalt is mined, you have what's called the Shinkolobwe mine. Shinkolobwe is the world's purest uranium mine, and the uranium that was milled and mined in Shinkolobwe eventually ended up in the world's first atomic weapons as part of the Manhattan Project. The mining of the Shinkolobwe mine was overseen by Belgian authorities who are known for being particularly brutal, and the people working there usually end up with radiation sickness and high rates of genetic defects thereafter. In most of these cases, if you couldn't get really cheap coal, uranium, and cobalt, it would be very difficult to have things like nuclear weapons and large language models, let alone to have them be profitable. Oops. When we talk about existential threats in my field, people often think of them as being individual, isolated threats that are thrown up by technology. Things like nuclear weapons, climate change, and lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots. But as I hope to show here, they actually are all reliant upon the same global systems of inequality and material extraction, and all of them opposing what we often call global catastrophic risk. In short, an unprecedented risk that roughly 10% or more of the global population is lost in the space of decades. Something which could result in either global societal collapse or potentially, in the very worst cases, human extinction. It's that upper end of the spectrum, societal collapse or extinction, that we usually refer to as existential risk. And it's worthwhile bearing in mind that these aren't just connected in their production, they're also connected in their consequences. Here is a quick map which shows areas of the world with a cross-hatching where you're likely to see 29 degrees mean annual temperature by 2075 under a medium emissions scenario. In other words, 29 degrees Celsius is roughly a temperature, an average that only 200 million people experience today, usually in the Sahara and the Persian Gulf, and never people who have built up infrastructure and cities. This in the future could cover 2 billion people. But importantly, it's also going to hit the most fragile states, shown here by the Fragile States Index, the countries in red and pink, for instance, are hit hardest. And additionally, it's going to hit two different nuclear powers, Pakistan, India, and seven different biosafety level 4 facilities, the labs working on the world's most dangerous pathogens. In short, it's all connected, both in production and in consequences. And we want to zoom in a little bit on climate change here. So in the future, we could experience global warming of roughly 2 degrees to 6 degrees Celsius. We currently are roughly somewhere between 1.3 to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And yet, when we think about global emissions, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that this is not equally distributed. Approximately three-quarters of global emissions come from just 10 countries, if you count the EU as one. And cumulative global emissions, so all the emissions throughout history tallied up, roughly a quarter of those are down to one country, the United States. And importantly, even when you think about this from a class angle, it's also highly concentrated. roughly 57 companies since the ratification of the Paris Agreement in 2016 had been responsible for 80% of industrial emissions. The richest 1% emit more than the bottom 66% of humanity. And one study looking across five what we often call planetary boundaries, so big environmental concerns such as biosphere degradation and climate change. Across those five, the top 10% of wealth holders were responsible for somewhere between 31 to 67% of planetary degradation. So this is not a simple matter of essentially all of humanity for its greed contributing to global destruction. Instead, it's usually about inequality, about a very small number of people, corporations, and countries who hold the most power and wealth, degrading the planet. And importantly, they seem to know that if people knew what they were doing, it would result in some kind of backlash, because most of these threats, whether it's climate change or AI, are crafted in secrecy. For instance, Exxon knew about the impacts of climate change back in the 1970s. They did their own internal modeling, and internal memos even suggested that climate change could result in dramatic consequences and needed to be acted upon swiftly. Exxon, in response, hid and buried the information and ran misinformation and disinformation campaigns that were funded by tens of millions of dollars, as did many other fossil fuel companies. The same is true of 3M and DuPont, big chemical manufacturers here in the US, when they found out about the damages their products like PFAS could do. And today, there's many AI companies who suggest that potentially their new algorithms, that AI could eventually result in either human extinction or huge global calamity. And yet, whenever there's a sign of regulation in the US, they tend to veto it, as was the case with SB 1047, a piece of legislation going through the California, which would have held companies liable for damages caused by very large algorithms. That was essentially vetoed by the governor because he was under heavy pressure from lobbying groups from Google and others. And of course, as we all know, there's a big revolving door, both between the military industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry, and government. But in short, we have a system in which risk today is produced by a very small number of actors who tend to hide it from the public and tend to be disproportionately wealthy and powerful. When you think about, say, for instance, the very big arms manufacturers in the US, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, or when you think of the fossil fuel industry, you're thinking of billionaire industries with huge concentrations of wealth and political power. So inequality is once again the key driver behind collapse today. I cover much, much more in the book, Goliath's Curse, but I'll stop there for now since I think we're already hitting roughly 40 minutes in approximately. But hopefully I've given you a good overview of how inequality has played a fundamental role, both in the rise of the very first Goliaths, their fall throughout history, and it's likely to also be determinant of whether or not we make it through the coming centuries. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Luke. And I will open it up for questions. I have a few questions of my own. You're in very bright Washington sunshine. You kind of you're quite angelic on my screen here, actually. But
It's heavenly, isn't it? A halo effect.
being angelic, please give us some good news because I think it all sounds very very it is quite doom and gloom. So I guess what's the solution? You've said there have been cases of Goliaths falling. Who instigates the fall? What kind of people? How does it happen if it's not a natural disaster like you're talking about the droughts and things?
Mm.
What kind of people? Like you said, most people are quite egalitarian actually in their nature. So how do those people get a grip and topple these Goliaths? What should we be doing?
Yeah, the bad news is we don't have many cases where inequality's been reversed in any kind of lasting fashion without going through a collapse first. There's a couple, and one that gives me a bit of hope is, weirdly enough, the case of ancient Athens, where there's both conquest by neighboring Sparta and then an internal revolution. And essentially, thereafter, you have a pretty intense form of democracy, what we often refer to as deliberative democracy, where essentially citizens are selected at random. They have to serve either in the assembly or in other forms of government. And thereafter, they basically slot out after a year or so, and new people are picked. That's something which seems to more or less keep wealth inequality in check. And Greece, when it's eventually conquered, it's not any kind of internal collapse. It's basically just is conquered by a superior military foe. And
Mhm.
in the book, I do have a fairly hopeful ending in many ways. The book actually did make me more hopeful overall, particularly about humans. One thing I put forward is that most of the ways of reducing existential threats and reducing existential risk, reducing the risk of collapse, are all good things. They're things we should want to do anyway. Reducing carbon emissions is something that isn't just good for climate change, but it also means that roughly another 12 million people today who lose their lives due to carbon-based emissions will no longer die. When you think about things like having more intense democracy, or of course having greater distribution of riches and more equality, they are again pretty good things. So we're lucky to live in a universe and a world where doing the right thing and making a better society actually makes for a safer one as well.
Yeah. So you're saying that even if we're just tinkering, we feel we're just tinkering and we can't, we can't sort of kill Goliath, as it were. Even the efforts to try and do that themselves beneficial in different ways to the world and to humanity.
Exactly. And eventually killing Goliath, basically picking apart dominance hierarchies and replacing them with new forms of governance based more upon shared power, mutual aid, reciprocity, they will also build a better world.
Yeah.
And I think we actually have a lot better shot than we did previously. Two of the things I point towards in the book is one, we have much better information now than we did in the past. We can look to the past to understand that pharaohs weren't smarter or better than everyone else. There's no particular good reason as to why they were in power.
No, they were
We can
just
understand that
wicked.
inequality. Yeah, exactly. And we can understand the role inequality plays in collapse. And importantly, we have much better technology to actually do things like democracy at scale and to control things like tax havens. So
Mhm.
I think that there's a lot of changes which actually mean we can do this. And
That's
in
true.
many ways, it's just doing what we've done for the first 300,000 years of humanity.
Yeah. And we do also, we often talk about how connected the world is and how social media and AI and all that is very much, vulnerable to bad actors, and how powerful, how some, Russian interference in Brexit and
Mm,
elections and all of this sort of stuff we worry about, and the use of these the bad actors employing these tools
mm,
in order to control and take control of our democracies. But it's also true that ordinary people have access to those tools as well, and that if we could use them, potentially use them for good as well, if we can employ them in the right way and engage the majority of people in using them as a force for good. So I
yeah.
don't think we've worked out how to do that yet, but I think it's certainly a possibility. Are there
Yeah.
any other questions from the floor? I have a couple more, but if anyone else wants to ask one, please do raise your hand or pop it in the chat. We have a raised hand from Mary Shepson. Would you like to put your sound on, unmute yourself, Mary, and ask away?
Sure. Hi, Luke. Thanks very much for this. Was a really interesting talk. I have your book, but I'm afraid I haven't read it yet. I've actually got loads of questions. I'm a Near Eastern archaeologist, so
Oh,
obviously I've
Actually.
got potentially quite a lot. But I guess the main one is archaeology, certainly in my region of the world,
Mm,
is looking quite a lot now, focusing less on explaining collapse and more on explaining persistence.
yeah.
And one of the things that's coming out of that research is a finding that certainly in Western Asia and also in places like the Nile Delta, persistence seems to be higher the larger the polity and the larger the settlement. So I
Yeah.
was wondering how you marry that up with your idea that essentially higher inequality should be less stable. So if you
Yeah.
have larger qualities, you have larger settlements, they should be inherently less stable and therefore last less time. Whereas the archaeological evidence that we currently have suggests that the larger polities, larger settlements tend to be have more persistence, have longer lifespans.
Yeah. Yes, this is actually based upon some work from a colleague of mine, Dan Lawrence, who specialized in Southwest Asia, who you may know. Yeah. Yeah, Dan's great. Um, Yeah, so a couple of things here. One is that so interestingly, Dan's initial research around this found that essentially over time, polity length, well, no, it was actually settlement length tends to decrease. And he basically said that over time, as you get more complexity, which is often used in archaeology, is kind of a bit of a buzzword for hierarchy, concentration of power, inequality, etc., you tend to get less and less settlement duration. So basically, settlements in what 8,000 BC are less long-lived than ones in 10,000 BC. As you mentioned, he's got a new piece of evidence out or new article out, which basically finds that in general, bigger polities and bigger settlements tend to last longer. So we're actually doing a bit of work together on this, and I think one of the key things is that as you get bigger polities, they tend to eat up the smaller, more egalitarian ones. So that's one of the key reasons why the less egalitarian societies tend to basically last not as quite as long. And on top of that, often we're looking at settlement duration rather than polity duration. And the settlements, as you mentioned, often do survive through collapse. And essentially, the kind of material extraction and resource they take from the surrounding areas means they're more likely to just persist for longer. So it's pretty good to be the capital of an empire in many ways, and it means you're probably going to last longer. It doesn't mean that necessarily inequality is better for you per se. But this is something we're actually testing right now through a study with the Santa Fe Institute. We're trying to basically marry up Dan's data on settlement length with some of the data I have on polity length and see if more or less accounting for imperial reign can also account for why bigger settlements tend to last longer. But excellent question. And feel free to send me an email afterwards to discuss more.
Sure, no, it's
Okay,
great to hear that you're working with Dan
Yeah,
because that's exactly the paper I was thinking of.
yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah,
brilliant.
thank
Well,
you.
we're having a history geek moment here, but that's a really good question. Thank you. We now have a question from Charlotte. Charlotte, go ahead. You take yourself off mute.
Yes, there we go. Lower your expectations now. This is not an academic question at all. It's more kind of a thinking out loud thing of do you think that and I appreciate you're an American, we're in the UK, but some of the things that you were talking about, I can kind of see almost happening here at the moment. In that kind of
Charlotte,
thing
just to
that
correct you, Luke's not American. He's actually Australian and works in Cambridge in England. He's on a tour.
Oh, you said that he
He
was in
is
the California sunshine or
no,
something.
he's in
Oh, so
Washington DC.
you're not in the US all the time.
No, he's
Yep.
gone to. I
Okay,
think
sorry.
yeah, he's doing a lot of
That
interviews.
did confuse me a little bit with the Cambridge thing at the bottom. So you just happen to be in the States at the moment. Okay. But yeah, so the thing the things that are happening over here at the moment, and the very I suppose unhappiness is an underestimate of it, but the feeling from a lot of people that they are being left behind, and you know they're blaming everything on immigration and all that sort of thing. Um, do you think that we're at that point where that is all happening, and then it's all going to collapse? And if that is the case, do the people who are at the top of that pile at the moment, and kind of trying to uh, they are having the control over everybody else, or
Mm.
that they feel that they're at the top of the pile. Do they not realize that that is what they're doing? I suppose that they don't. And then when it collapses, does it then go? Do we then start the cycle again and try and become more equal again, and then it just kind of all goes wrong, and the same thing happens, and then it collapses again? You know, is it a cycle
Mm.
that we're on historically, do you think? And are we in part of that cycle at the moment over here? Sorry, that wasn't very clear because I was sort of thinking it as I was talking it.
Yeah. No worries, no worries. And I think that's sufficiently clear. Is this cyclical and are we just in the middle of another cycle? Some people, like Peter Turchin, will claim that this is always part of a more or less predictable cycle. I think I demur a little bit. I think there's definitely cycles when it comes to more or less wealth inequality. So Walter's work points towards this. There's actually a new paper on long-run wage inequality in China, which points towards a similar thing that you tend to more or less see wealth inequality rise during dynastic reigns and then it decreases during the fall. I think there's a few things different today, which may be either grounds for, well, comfort or not. But one thing is that states today have far better ways to control their citizens. We have intelligence agencies, police forces, military, etc. Worthwhile bearing in mind, most pre-modern polities didn't even have census data, let alone really well-functioning police forces. So it doesn't mean it'll result in collapse as previously old civil war necessarily. That's not necessarily a good thing. It'll probably mean that tend to get less and less inclusive forms of governance and still all the kind of corrosive effects and inequality. And as mentioned, I do think there's ways of actually getting out of wealth inequality rising. There's some pretty obvious ways of reducing wealth inequality, ranging from progressive taxation, wealth taxes, and even having a tax on wealth. Beyond $10 million, there's not really much need for anyone to have that much money. And when they do, it tends to result in pretty pernicious effects for our democracy.
Is one of
So
our
I don't see this.
policies
Hmm? Yeah,
wealth tax, as you
excellent.
would expect?
Naturally. Um, but yeah, I don't think this is fully cyclical. And actually, something Mary mentioned is very important here as well, is that collapse is about power structures, but there's persistence of many things, including things like settlements, usually local communities, cultures, languages, things like that. There's often a big debate in archaeology over collapse versus resilience, because many things do prove resilient. One would hope that's the same going to the future, but in the book, I suggest that things might be different if you have a really full-blown destructive collapse involving things like nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Okay, we do have Vicky with her hand up. So Vicky, thanks for that. Just ask your question. Just got a few minutes.
Hi there. So you've talked about collapse in terms of both risk and renewal. So what
Hmm.
opportunities, if we talk about sort of modern day collapse versus historical collapse,
Hmm.
quite a different thing because we're also interconnected now and reliant on things. None of us could really
Yeah.
be self-sufficient. Are there any opportunities that could emerge from a modern day collapse, do you think?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about this idea of the Death Star syndrome, drawing, of course, from the Death Star from Star Wars. This almost impregnable, invulnerable big weapon that seemingly can't be destroyed until you hit it in the right spot. And there's evidence that big, interconnected, complex systems are kind of the same. They're really good at buffering against small shocks, but if a shock is sufficiently large, it can kind of amplify through the system. And I've laid the case that this could be true of collapse, that when you look at modern day state failure, most studies suggest it doesn't tend to last long. A state, a working judiciary, etc., is usually propped up within roughly 6 months. But if we look at, say, for instance, the 2008 global financial crisis, a housing bubble in the US caused a global financial crisis. So a sufficiently large shock can permeate and basically be amplified through the system. And that's because of interdependence. The bright side here is that, as mentioned, interdependence can basically buffer against smaller shocks, meaning we can hopefully prevent smaller shocks from growing into larger ones. But importantly, when I think about the big risks we face today, they all require international cooperation. One of the big taglines of why the future looks kind of grim is if you have increasing arms races with improving technology over the space of decades or centuries, where is it going to end? And I don't think we rely upon deterrence, for instance, given that we've had nuclear weapons for a couple of decades, 12, a dozen near misses, and many of those were just sheer dumb luck that we didn't end up in a nuclear war. But in short, we need to have international cooperation, and I think that requires a good degree of independence. Independence can help us avoid wars, and I think it can help us actually do democracy across borders.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that hopeful answer. David, we've just got time for a couple more questions. David, go ahead.
Yeah, very interesting lecture. Thank you very much. Do you think it's possible for a group of people, say, for example, in the present context, a political party, to combat Goliath successfully without risking becoming a Goliath in its own turn? And if so, do you know of any examples from the past?
Yes, this is an ongoing debate in political science, what we often call prefigurative politics. That when you look at many big revolutions that were in the name of equality, they usually were themselves very often unequal and hierarchical. And when they got into power, they tended to replicate that. So the idea being that the form you take in pursuit of power is the one that you replicate while in power. I think there's ways of avoiding this, and I think one of them is actually pushing for governance mechanisms like deliberative democracy, which essentially more or less bypass the need for concentrating power. And I think there's a good chance these can succeed much more today. If you look at the average Trump voter and the average Bernie Sanders supporter, they're actually pretty similar. They have a very similar narrative in their mind, the kind of populist narrative of there's a large number of there's a large number of elites who are corrupt and not representing our interests. And this is slowly leading to worse lives for us. And if we had more say in our politics, the world would be a better place. I think there's a truth to that. And I think in many ways, if you can find a way to craft a political response which draws upon that anger and directs it towards having things like wealth taxes rather than scapegoating minorities and migrants, I can see it working pretty well. Unfortunately, both here in the US and elsewhere, the left hasn't been particularly good at actually crafting that kind of narrative.
Also, the as you mentioned earlier, the political power and also the control of resources and the money is very concentrated and
Yeah.
very much in support of those more negative narratives at the moment, which is yeah, what we struggle with. All our opponents are a lot richer than we are, which is a problem.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, I have a question which might be provocative. You've talked about wealth inequality a lot, and clearly that's key in all of these situations. But you've also used the word patriarchy quite a lot. Is there
Mm.
any evidence in your work that matriarchal cultures that are more led by women are more successful than patriarchy?
Oh, successful in terms of persistence and
Yes,
lasting
persistence
longer?
and equality. Yeah, yeah.
Mm. Essentially, not that I'm aware of. The studies around settlement and poverty persistence, settlements persistence are a bit longer, a bit larger body of evidence. There's far less when it comes to poverty persistence, and I haven't seen any related to looking at patriarchy versus matriarchy. So I don't know. In terms of equality, the difficulty is that most, well, obviously industrialized, but also pre-modern agrarian states tend to be patriarchal,
Mhm,
and the ones which are usually nomadic egalitarians often do have more shared political power, even though there's often division of labor when it comes to the sexes. But it's difficult to say because nomadic egalitarians just are by nature more equal as well.
mhm,
So, in short, we don't know.
mhm. Interesting. Okay, well, we're just about out of time. So, can I just say a massive thank you to Luke for a really interesting talk? And I really want to get through the book now because there's so much, I've got so many more questions that we haven't had time to cover. So, I hope everyone else has got a hands on the copy of the book as well. Really, really good. Thanks to everyone for coming. I just want to do a shout out for a couple of other things that are coming up. We do this equality hour every month. You're very welcome to come along another time, Luke, if you want to listen to some other stuff. We next month we're talking about the White Ribbon campaign. Charlotte's going to lead that one in the run up to White Ribbon Day. And we also actually, I think interestingly, a lot of the history that we draw on is also coming from patriarchy. And we in the UK, there's been a study, a report published this week from End Sexism in Schools, which has been looking at the history curriculum and how biased the history curriculum is. So we're going to have the author of that report come probably not next month, but the month after to talk about the history curriculum and how it can be made better so that our children can get a more balanced education and we can learn more about what the women were doing back then as well as what the patriarchs were doing. Um, we did just have another comment that someone came up with. Um, We've got a few comments in the chats. Thank you very much. This is really interesting. Huge thanks. Fascinating, interesting, terrifying, and hopeful. Thank you very much. Very interesting and inspiring. Thanks, Luke. Really thought-provoking, really interesting and enlightening. Thank you. So lots of really good comments. Thank you so much for taking the time, Luke, and thanks to everyone for coming. Do keep in touch with us. We'd love to see what you do next. And hopefully the rest of your trip in the States will go well. And lots of people spend time reviewing and admiring your book, which I know they're already doing. There's a few
And
links in the chat, folks, just before you leave.
Mhm.
Thanks once again, and good night.
Excellent. And thank you for hosting me and for organizing, and thank you everyone for attending. I appreciate your time and patience.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.
Cheers.